DeJong gets life in prison for the murder of husband by Luke Nichols, Beatrice Daly's son.
Do you have
May 3, 2012, Fairbury. Laura DeJong wiped tears from her eyes as District Judge Paul Korslund talked about her uncle, Thomas DeJong. In Jefferson County District Court on Thursday morning, Laura, who sat with other members of Thomas DeJong's family, remembered her good times with Thomas. He was a jokester and a family man who was great with children. Laura was robbed of her uncle in March 2011 when Thomas DeJong's wife, Susan DeJong, brutally beat him for several days until he died from his injuries. Susan DeJong was convicted of first-degree murder and received a mandatory sentence of life in prison Thursday morning. She received an additional 50 years for the use of a deadly weapon, which is the maximum sentence for that charge. Susan DeJong was allowed to speak before the sentence was handed down. She wept and quietly said, "You're all wrong." Laura DeJong thought justice was served Thursday, but thought Susan DeJong deserved a second life sentence for the life she took from Thomas DeJong before she murdered him. "I can't even imagine the years that he had to live in such fear and pain," Laura DeJong said. "So I think justice has been served, but she got away with stealing his life from him before she killed him." Before handing down his sentence, Korslund talked about Thomas DeJong. He referred to him as a quiet man and a hard worker who was well thought of by his colleagues. "He suffered horribly," Korslund said to Susan DeJong. "Thomas DeJong was a suffering servant. He did not deserve the brutal assault that was inflicted on him over days. And Ms. DeJong, you did nothing until it was too late to obtain medical treatment for him." Korslund said the dynamics of the relationship between Thomas and Susan DeJong were hard to understand, but what was clear was that Thomas provided for her. He suffered ruthless treatment without justification. "He paid for staying with you with his life," Korslund said. Corey O'Brien of the Nebraska Attorney General's office was the main prosecutor in the case against Susan DeJong. His argument was brief Thursday, but he said Susan DeJong deserved the maximum sentence on the weapon charge. He told the court the family would never know exactly what happened to Thomas DeJong during those 3 days, but said it was obvious that weapons were used. "We do believe that the use of weapons in this case is so substantial and so severe," O'Brien said, "and the result showed an indignity to human life that is incomprehensible. It is something that is deserving of a maximum sentence to be added to her life term." Susan DeJong's attorney, James Mowbray, did not speak during sentencing. The charges of which Susan DeJong has been convicted stem from an incident on March 11, 2011, when Susan DeJong called 911 to ask that an ambulance be sent immediately to their residence 8 miles west of Fairbury. DeJong told dispatch that Thomas was unresponsive and wasn't breathing. She described him as looking like he had been through a meat grinder. An ambulance took Thomas DeJong to Jefferson Community Health Center and then to Bryan LGH in Lincoln, where he died from his injuries. His cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to his head, torso, and limbs. DeJong alleged that Thomas left the Monday before his death for a job interview in Seward and then drove to South Dakota to see a mistress. DeJong alleged that the mistress inflicted the injuries on Thomas and that he drove home afterward. Testimony indicated that Thomas used his cell phone in the Fairbury area on the days Susan DeJong alleged he was in South Dakota. Doctors also testified that it would be impossible for Thomas to drive with the injuries he sustained. Laura DeJong said her uncle changed when he met Susan DeJong. She likes to think back to the times before that when he wasn't suffering and had a big smile and a twinkle in his eye. "The only silver lining," Laura said, "if I can find one, is that he's now free." Guilty as charged by Luke Nichols, Beatrice Daly's son, February 27, 2012, Fairbury. Susan DeJong showed little emotion when a 12-person jury rendered its guilty verdict Monday afternoon in Jefferson County District Court. After about 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found DeJong guilty of first-degree murder and use of a weapon to commit a felony. After the verdict was read, as Judge Paul Korslund began thanking the jury for its service, it began to sink in for DeJong. She broke down in tears, and the only person to console her was her attorney, James Mowbray, who could only rub her back as she wept. It was the conclusion of a week-long trial that saw 23 witnesses called and more than 200 exhibits presented. When it was all said and done, the jury decided that Susan DeJong did indeed kill her husband and that she intended to do it. Earlier, Monday morning during his closing argument, Corey O'Brien of the Nebraska Attorney General's office held up a hammer for the entire jury to see. It was the hammer found in a red duffel bag inside Susan DeJong's pickup truck the day after her husband's death on March 11, 2011. The hammers contained spatters of blood on them, belonging to both Susan DeJong and her husband, Thomas DeJong. O'Brien called it the smoking gun in this case and said the only reasonable explanation as to why that hammer was concealed in that duffel bag, along with a pair of bloody pajamas, was to cover up a murder. You've heard the tragic story of a senseless and excruciatingly painful killing of a middle-aged man, O'Brien told the jury Monday morning. Committed by his especially cold-hearted and controlling wife, a wife who was consumed by a jealous and obsessive fantasy that not only was her husband having an extramarital affair, but that he and his lover were actively conspiring to kill her. O'Brien slowly detailed all of the injuries found on Thomas DeJong's body, both on the exterior and interior. He had black eyes, a broken nose, and other cuts on his face. There were cuts and abrasions on his torso, arms, legs, and back. Internally, Thomas had swelling of the brain, massive bleeding in the chest and abdomen, 8 rib fractures, a collapsed lung, and several fractures to the vertebrae. O'Brien reminded the jury that several experts testified that it was the worst beating they'd ever seen. Throughout the trial, O'Brien and Jefferson County Attorney Linda Bauer dissected Susan DeJong's theory that Thomas DeJong had left Fairbury to see a mistress in South Dakota and returned with the injuries. O'Brien told the jury that Thomas DeJong never left that house, and those injuries were acquired over an excruciating 2-day period. He claimed that Susan DeJong waited until Thomas wasn't breathing to call 911 because if she did, Thomas might tell people what she did. O'Brien said there were too many inconsistencies and too many coincidences for this not to be a murder. We heard wild stories, many excuses, and lots of blaming others, O'Brien said. To prove intent, O'Brien referred to an instant message conversation Susan DeJong had with her son, in which she said, "I'm looking at getting rid of Tom. I can't take it anymore. I'm going insane." O'Brien said Susan DeJong had refused to divorce Thomas, so the only thing she could mean by getting rid of Tom was to kill him. Mowbray conceded that the circumstances surrounding Thomas DeJong's death is suspicious, but said the prosecution hadn't presented enough facts to convict Susan DeJong. He conceded, however, that the evidence clearly showed that Thomas didn't go to South Dakota. "But we don't know where he went," Mowbray said. "The state speculates that he was at home, but the state has done nothing to prove that. Maybe he slept in his blazer for 2 days or registered at a motel." Investigators were so convinced and focused to rush to judgment that this was first-degree murder that nobody looked into that. Mowbray often referred to testimony given by Dr. Robert Bucks, the chief medical examiner for the El Paso County Coroner's Office in Colorado Springs. Bucks is a certified forensic pathologist, which requires additional training. He contested several opinions brought forth by doctors called by the state. Mowbray referred to Bucks's testimony that there wasn't enough blood found at the DeJong house to justify that Thomas's beating took place there. He also reiterated Bucks's testimony that the marks found on Thomas's body were not consistent with a hammer. Mowbray said he couldn't explain how Thomas got his injuries but offered possible theories, such as getting robbed or getting into a fight. But he said the theory that Susan DeJong beat him up is impossible. "The state will have you believe that she beat him up this extensively and Thomas didn't run or fight back," Mowbray said. "He just took it. Using common sense and reason, there's no way any human being will be subjected to that without fighting back or getting out of there." As for the hammers in the duffel bag, Mowbray said he believed they were previously in the bag, and Susan DeJong threw her clothes on top of them before leaving for Lincoln that night. O'Brien was given a chance to counter and said the defense was trying to steer the jury away from the big picture. He said when you put it all together, however, the possibility of it all being a coincidence is impossible. "They want you to focus on single pieces of evidence and say this isn't possible," O'Brien said. "Don't fall into the trap they're asking you to fall into. Susan DeJong tried to kill Thomas and she needs to be held accountable." Jurors and attorneys declined to comment Monday afternoon after the verdict was read. The charges of which Susan DeJong has been convicted of stem from an incident on March 11, 2011, in which Susan DeJong called 911 to ask that an ambulance be sent immediately to their residence 8 miles west of Fairbury. DeJong told dispatch that her husband, Thomas, was unresponsive and wasn't breathing. She described him as looking like he had been through a meat grinder. An ambulance transported Thomas DeJong to Jefferson Community Health Center and then to Bryan LGH in Lincoln, where he died from his injuries. His cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to his head, torso, and limbs. DeJong alleged that Thomas left the Monday before his death for a job interview in Seward, and then proceeded to drive to South Dakota to see a mistress. DeJong alleges that the mistress inflicted the injuries on Thomas and that he drove home afterward. Testimony indicated that Thomas used his cell phone in the Fairbury area on the days Susan DeJong alleges he was in South Dakota. Doctors also testified that it would be impossible for Thomas to drive with the injuries he sustained. Sentencing for Susan DeJong has been set for May 3rd at 11 a.m. DeJong murder trial continues by Luke Nichols, Beatrice Daly's son, February 24, 2012. All evidence has been presented in the Susan DeJong murder trial in Jefferson County District Court, and closing arguments are scheduled to begin Monday morning. After 3 days of witness testimony, the prosecution rested its case at about 10 a.m. Friday. The defense presented 3 witnesses and rested its case at about 3:12 p.m. DeJong is accused of beating her husband to death last March. She is charged with first-degree murder and use of a weapon to commit a felony. The charges stem from an incident on March 11, 2011, in which Susan DeJong called 911 to ask that an ambulance be sent immediately to their residence 8 miles west of Fairbury. DeJong told dispatch that her husband, Thomas, was unresponsive and wasn't breathing. She described him as looking like he had been through a meat grinder. An ambulance transported Thomas DeJong to Jefferson Community Health Center and then to Bryan LGH in Lincoln, where he died from his injuries. His cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to his head, torso, and limbs. DeJong alleged that Thomas left the Monday before his death for a job interview in Seward and then proceeded to drive to South Dakota to see a mistress. DeJong alleges that the mistress inflicted the injuries on Thomas and that he drove home afterward. Testimony has indicated, however, that Thomas used his cell phone in the Fairbury area on the days Susan DeJong alleges he was in South Dakota. Doctors have also testified that it would be impossible for Thomas to drive with the injuries he sustained. The defense called Dr. Robert Bucks to the stand Friday. Bucks is the chief medical examiner for the El Paso County Coroner's Office in Mao, Colorado Springs, Colo. He's board-certified in anatomical, clinical, and forensic pathology. Many of the opinions offered by Bucks on Friday differed from testimony from Douglas County anatomical pathologist Dr. Gene Thompson on Thursday. He said a forensic pathologist, which requires more training, is needed in cases like this. Bucks disputed Thompson's claims that the hammer claw could have caused marks on the back of Thomas DeJong's body. "I don't think a standard claw hammer could have made those marks," Bucks said. "I've done cases in which hammers have murdered people, and this just doesn't look like a hammer did it." Bucks disputed that Thomas DeJong suffered blunt force trauma to the head. He said the bruises and cuts to Thomas's face and head weren't significant enough to cause trauma. He said swelling of the brain was caused by Thomas going into cardiac arrest and then being resuscitated. He said if the heart stops and the brain goes without oxygen for several minutes, irreversible brain damage will take place, including swelling. Bucks also said the injuries to Thomas's face would cause significant bleeding, meaning there should have been more blood found in the house. "I didn't see a sufficient amount of blood to indicate the assault took place in the house," Bucksy said. "It would have had to take place somewhere else." Bucks said that based on the injuries, the assault would have had to take place 24 to 48 hours before Thomas went into cardiac arrest. Bucks said he's done more than 6,000 autopsies in his career and has never seen a case in which a person had so many soft contusions. "This guy was beaten," he said. Bucks disagreed with the previous doctor's testimony that Thomas wouldn't have been able to drive with the injuries he sustained. He certainly could have been moving around before he went into cardiac arrest, Bucks said. Bucks also testified that there was a trace of alcohol found in Thomas DeJong's body. It was his opinion that 12 hours prior, at about 7:30 a.m. on March 11th, his blood alcohol level would have been 15. Bucks didn't dispute that Thomas' death was a homicide, but questioned whether there was intent to kill. "That's what's bizarre," Bucks said. "When people try to kill somebody, they're going for an area that will be lethal, like the head or neck. These are mainly soft tissue and muscle injuries to the lower extremities, BACK, and abdominal area." Through cross-examination, Corey O'Brien of the Nebraska Attorney General's office established that Bucks has come to Nebraska numerous times to testify and criticize Nebraska for not having state law-required board-certified forensic pathologists. O'Brien also indicated that a board-certified forensic pathologist assisted Thompson in performing a second autopsy of Thomas's body. Bucks said he wasn't aware of that. The court also heard testimony from Susan DeJong's oldest son, Alex Smart, who became quite close to Thomas even though he wasn't his biological father. "I considered him my dad and we were pretty close," Smart said as he fought back tears. Smart said his mother loved Thomas, and despite the occasional verbal argument, he never observed of physical altercations between them. He said Susan made him aware, however, of her suspicions that Thomas was not faithful to her. "She was heartbroken," Smart said. "She couldn't believe the man she dearly loved would do that to her. She couldn't believe it." Despite the suspicions, Smart said he was impressed with how Susan and Thomas were getting along when they lived in Fairbury. The trial is scheduled to resume Monday at 9 a.m. with closing arguments. Jury hears details about Thomas DeJong's injuries by Luke Nichols. Beatrice Daily Sun, February 23, 2012. Fairbury. Jurors in the Susan DeJong murder trial spent Thursday afternoon viewing detailed photos of Thomas DeJong's injuries. Douglas. County pathologist Dr. Jean Thompson conducted the autopsy on Thomas on March 12, 2011. She described in detail the numerous injuries found on Thomas's body, including injuries to his head, neck, arms, legs, hands, back, and torso. Towards the end of her testimony, when Corey O'Brien of the Nebraska Attorney General's office asked her opinion on the manner of Thomas's death, Thompson simply stated, "This was a homicide." Susan DeJong is on trial for allegedly beating her husband to death on March 11, 2011. She's charged with first-degree murder and use of a weapon to commit a felony. The charges stem from an incident on March 11, 2011, when Susan DeJong called 911 to request an ambulance be sent to their home about 8 miles west of Fairbury. Her husband, Thomas DeJong, had become unresponsive and wasn't breathing. She described his body as looking like it went through a meat grinder. Thomas was transported to Jefferson Community Medical Center and then to Bryan LGH in Lincoln, where he eventually died from his injuries. Despite blaming her husband's injuries on an alleged mistress who lived in South Dakota, Susan DeJong became the main suspect in her husband's death. During her testimony, Thompson said she's never seen injuries as extensive as what Thomas had. She determined his death to be caused by blunt force trauma to the head, torso, and extremities. O'Brien directed Thompson's attention to specific injuries on Thomas's back and asked if they could have been caused by the claw of a hammer. Through testimony on Tuesday, it was determined that 2 hammers were found in a bag in Susan DeJong's car. One of those hammers had spatters of blood on it. "It could have been a hammer used on Thomas's back," Thompson said. "Mostly because of the shape of the abrasions on the back. They are C-shape or semicircular and kind of rounded like a hammer." Dr. Juris Purins, a radiologist at Lincoln Radiology, testified Thursday afternoon about fractured bones detected through Thomas CT scans. He described rare injuries found on Thomas's body, including 7 to 10 fractures in his nose and a dislocation of the lens in his right eye. Purins said that particular injury would only allow Thomas to see light or dark through that eye. Purins said Thomas had a tremendous amount of fractures in his chest cavity, spine, and scapula. "You usually don't see many fractures in the scapula because it's so well protected," Purins said. There were quite a few rib fractures too, and it takes a lot to break some of those little bones. Purin said Thomas also had a collapsed lung and a fractured hyoid bone, which is a horseshoe-shaped bone situated in the neck. Purin said it's rare for this bone to be fractured unless some type of strangulation takes place. He said there's only 21 documented cases in which the hyoid bone has been fractured without strangulation. In an attempt to further debunk Susan DeJong's theory that Thomas was beat up by his alleged mistress in South Dakota and drove home afterward, O'Brien asked if Thomas would be able to drive with these injuries. Purin said it would be impossible. The ability to walk and talk is severely compromised in patients with this kind of trauma, Purin said. When you see patients with injuries like this, they're down on the ground in the fetal position and they're not moving around a lot. Through cross-examination, Todd Lancaster of the Nebraska Commission of Public Advocacy asked Purin if some of the fractures could have been caused by kicking. Purin said some, but not all. Purin said the blunt force trauma found throughout Thomas's body could have been caused by a hammer, but admitted it could have been made by numerous other instruments as well, such as a baseball bat or a club. During the morning session, the jury heard testimony from Susan DeJong's biological son James Platt and his wife Sharon Platt. While living in South Dakota, Thomas and Susan DeJong drove to York in August of 2010 to visit the Platts. James Platt said when they arrived, Thomas was swollen and bruised with dry blood around his nose and ears. Thomas and Susan DeJong stayed in York for several weeks until Thomas found a job near Fairbury working at a farm for Brian Bauer. James said, when Thomas and Susan left for Fairbury, most of Thomas's wounds had healed up. James Platt said he drove to Fairbury to visit Thomas and Susan DeJong a couple times, and one of those times he noticed Thomas had a cut lip. I remember mentioning to my wife that Tom looks really bad today, James Platt said. Sharon Platt said she asked Susan DeJong about how Thomas got the cut lip, to which she replied, "The pigs got him." James Platt said his mother made him aware several times of her suspicions that Thomas was being unfaithful to her. James Platt remembers telling his mother on numerous occasions that if the situation was as bad as she said, she should leave him. Had been working for several months. Thomas would help out with chores around the farm. Bauer said that on March 7th, the day Susan DeJong alleges Thomas took off for South Dakota, Thomas worked a half day because he wanted to take a trip to Lincoln that afternoon. Bauer said Thomas returned to work on March 8th and worked a full day. Bauer noticed something different about Thomas, however. He just seemed like he was sore, Bauer said. He was having trouble getting around. Bauer said Thomas called the morning of March 9th saying he was feeling under the weather and took the day off. He also called on March 10th saying he still wasn't feeling well, but thought he could possibly work that afternoon. He never did. Bauer said he drove by the DeJong residence, a house provided to them by Bauer's family, on March 10th, and that both of DeJong's vehicles were on the property, including the blue Blazer that Susan DeJong alleged Thomas took to South Dakota. Bauer testified that Thomas would occasionally show up for work with marks on his forearms and hands. He also observed occasional bruising, black eyes, a chipped tooth, and a severely split lip. He said Thomas didn't receive those injuries at work. Dr. Stan O'Cason, a trauma surgeon at Bryan LGH in Lincoln, was the doctor who treated Thomas on March 11th. He said the amount of swelling and bruising Thomas had when he was brought in was very concerning. "That was my first sign that something wasn't right here," O'Cason said. He said Thomas had a low blood count, which he contributed to the swelling and bruising all over his body. O'Cason was more concerned, however, that Thomas had a potassium level of 8, which is more than twice the level of a normal person. He said a potassium level that high can stop the heart, which is why Thomas was immediately put on dialysis. A CAT scan was done to Thomas, which O'Cason said revealed that Thomas's brain was severely swollen due to what he believed to be blunt force trauma. Corey O'Brien of the Nebraska Attorney General's office, who's assisting with prosecution, asked O'Cason if being struck with a hammer would be considered blunt force. O'Cason said yes. O'Cason said the swelling and bruising on Thomas's body indicated he received most of the injuries at least 12 to 24 hours prior to him arriving at the hospital. It was also his opinion that there was no way Thomas could have driven a vehicle in the 48 hours prior because of the severity of his injuries. Korslund testified that at one point he talked to Susan DeJong to inquire about the source of all his bruising. She replied that the pigs on the farm did it to him, a theory that Korslund immediately dismissed. If he got those injuries from working at a pig farm, it's time to run away from that pig farm, Korslund said, because that pig must be really mad at you. During cross-examination, however, James Mowbray of the Nebraska Commission of Public Advocacy presented a medical article that stated, "CAT scans are good for immediate emergency detection of trauma, but they aren't reliable for courtroom testimony." Mowbray also said that a pathologist will later testify that there was no swelling of the brain found during the autopsy. Susan DeJong's trial will resume Thursday at 8:30 a.m. Judge Paul Korslund said attorneys think they'll be done with evidence on Friday and will have closing arguments on Monday. Other items from Wednesday's testimony and pictures were shown of Susan DeJong's hands that were taken the day after Thomas's death. She had several bruises and blisters on both hands, and Thomas DeJong was on life support the night he died. Susan DeJong gave doctors permission to take him off life support after they determined he wasn't going to survive. The video of the Lincoln Police Department's interrogation of Susan DeJong the night of Thomas's death was shown to the jury Wednesday morning. It lasted about 1 hour and 45 minutes, and DeJong showed a wide range of emotions. At times, she wept and at times was calm. And Orrin Hoffman, who was Thomas's employer in South Dakota, said Thomas was a quiet and shy man. He wasn't accident-prone or clumsy. He also indicated Thomas had a small speech impediment in which he occasionally stuttered. Murder trial begins in Fairbury by Luke Nichols, Beatrice Daly son. February 21st, 2012. Jurors listened intently, some with their eyes closed, as Susan DeJong's March 11, 2011 call to dispatch was played in court Tuesday morning. A hysterical, Susan DeJong told dispatch she needed an ambulance immediately because her husband, Thomas DeJong, had snuck off to be with his whore and came back all beat up. Susan DeJong told dispatch that Thomas wasn't breathing, had no pulse, and was cold to the touch. At the guidance of dispatch, she began performing CPR on Thomas. She counted aloud 30 chest compressions several times as she waited for the ambulance to arrive. At one point, Susan DeJong told dispatch that Thomas looked like he went through a meat grinder. Susan DeJong, who was allowed to wear civilian clothing for her trial, showed little emotion as the recording was played, other than occasionally closing her eyes as her voice became more hysterical. Thomas would eventually die from his injuries, and through an investigation it became apparent that his injuries may have been caused by Susan DeJong herself. Because of that, she's charged with first-degree murder and use of a weapon to commit a felony. During her opening statements, Jefferson County Attorney Linda Bauer told the jury that this is a story about a woman who became obsessed with suspicions that her husband was having a long-term extramarital affair. She said it's not the first time Thomas DeJong has been seen with such injuries. Bauer said Susan DeJong always had an excuse, however, blaming the injuries on other accidents, such as Thomas falling off a ladder or being robbed at a truck stop in Indiana. Susan DeJong's attorney, James Mowbray of the Nebraska Commission of Public Advocacy, cautioned the jury, however, telling them to have an open mind. "You're going to have more questions than answers," Mowbray said, "and that leads to reasonable doubt." Witnesses who were first called to the stand on Tuesday were medical providers who first tended to Thomas. EMT Cynthia Crawford said upon arrival, Thomas had no pulse, wasn't breathing, and was unresponsive. She, along with other first responders and hospital personnel, described Thomas as having lacerations, cuts, and bruising from head to toe. Pictures of the bruises on Thomas's face and body were occasionally shown to the jury. An investigator later testified that Thomas's injuries were so severe that law enforcement originally suspected he had been hit by a vehicle. When EMTs transported Thomas to Jefferson County Health Center in Fairbury, his heart began to pump again, which came as a shock because of the length of time he had been unresponsive and without a pulse. He had been dead for a while, Crawford said. Despite his heart pumping, Thomas's outlook for survival was bleak. He was eventually transported to Bryan LGH in Lincoln, where he would die from his injuries. Throughout the evening of March 11, 2011, Susan DeJong maintained her story that she hadn't seen Thomas since March 9th, and that he arrived at the couple's home on March 11th with the injuries. Several first responders indicated that DeJong blamed a woman in South Dakota, which is where the couple lived before moving to Jefferson County. Susan DeJong alleged that Thomas was having a long-term affair with the woman from South Dakota. Jefferson County Health Center LPN Rebecca McClure testified that Susan DeJong blamed the whore and alleged that the woman in South Dakota had given her husband a sexually transmitted disease, and they were plotting to give it to her to kill her. During the afternoon session of the trial, several investigators with the Nebraska State Patrol testified. Inverser Jeff Ward said that a search warrant was obtained for the DeJong's household the day after Thomas's death. Inside the house, investigators found blood spatters in the living room, kitchen, bathroom, master bedroom, and basement. No pools of blood were found, but Ward estimated there to be at least 70 blood spatters located throughout the house. Blood spots were found on items such as a tablecloth, a sword inside a sheath, bedding, several walls, the refrigerator, a door jamb, and a lampshade. Also found in the bathroom was a towel and 2 washcloths with an excessive amount of blood. In the basement, a pile of clothes was found with several items of clothing having blood spatter on it. Through cross-examination, Mowbray said it was impossible to determine how long the blood spatters had been on the various items. Attention was also drawn to a white Dodge pickup truck that Susan DeJong had driven to Lincoln the night of March 11th to be with her husband at the hospital. A spatter of blood was found on the hood of the truck. Also found inside the truck was a red duffel bag with several items in it, including clothes, Thomas's wallet, toiletries, and 2 hammers. One of the hammers, as well as a pair of pajamas, had spatters of dry blood on them. DeJong's trial is scheduled to resume on Wednesday beginning at 8:30 a.m. It is scheduled to last all week. District Judge Paul Korslund is presiding over the case. DeJong pleads not guilty by Luke Nichols, Beatrice Daly son. April 8, 2011. Fairbury, Susan DeJong pleaded not guilty in Jefferson County District Court Thursday afternoon. DeJong, 54, charged with first-degree murder of her husband, made her first appearance in District Court Thursday. Judge Paul Korslund presided over the hearing and advised DeJong of her rights. He also advised her of the charge against her, which carries a maximum punishment of life imprisonment without parole. Korslund accepted DeJong's not guilty plea and set a week-long jury trial beginning August 29. A pre-trial conference is scheduled for July 21st, in which DeJong is ordered to appear. DeJong was arrested the morning of March 12th on charges of first-degree murder. Her husband, Thomas DeJong, 52, was pronounced dead shortly before midnight March 11th at Bryan LGH Hospital in Lincoln. An autopsy ruled the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to his head, torso, and limbs. According to a probable cause affidavit released March 14th, Jefferson County Dispatch received a call on March 11th at about 4:02 p.m. from Susan DeJong at 55930 Highway 136, about 9 miles west of Fairbury. Susan DeJong reported that there was a 52-year-old male in her house, later identified as her husband Thomas DeJong, who wasn't breathing, was cold to the touch, and she didn't know if he had a pulse. Rescue units transported Thomas DeJong to Jefferson Community Health Center. He was then transferred to Lincoln. Susan DeJong drove herself to Lincoln. The emergency room doctor performed a CT scan of Thomas DeJong's skull and later described the injuries as blunt trauma to the brain. It was the doctor's opinion that the injuries were non-survivable. Doctors stated there was bruising at the back of the head, as well as a broken nose and contusions to the ocular area. Detectives interviewed Susan DeJong at the Lincoln Police Department. At first, she told detectives that Thomas DeJong did not hurt her, but later stated that he and another woman he may have been involved with has tried to kill her over the past 6 years. Susan DeJong told detectives that Thomas DeJong tried to kill her 2 years ago, saying, "He tried to kill me and I caught him doing it." Susan DeJong was transported to Fairbury, where she was lodged at the Jefferson County Jail for the alleged murder of her husband. "I've been doing this a long time and no scene is ever the same," Jefferson County Sheriff Nell Sorensen said the week of the alleged murder. "This started off as a medical call and then it turned into this. But we've had real good cooperation with the State Patrol and Lincoln Police Department, so I think we have things well in hand and we have a good case." A search warrant for the DeJong residence revealed blood splatter and cast-off of blood in numerous rooms. Sorensen said earlier this week that DeJong is no longer being lodged in Jefferson County, but rather the women's prison in York. Fairbury woman arrested after allegedly killing husband Friday by Corey Matheson. Lincoln Journal-Star, March 14, 2011. Investigators believe a rural Jefferson County woman violently beat her husband at their home Friday afternoon, hours before he died at a Lincoln hospital. Susan Marie DeJong, 54, was arrested Saturday on suspicion of the first-degree murder of Thomas DeJong, 52, according to Nebraska State Patrol spokeswoman Deb Collins. Just before 4 p.m. Friday, Susan DeJong called 911 and reported that her husband was not breathing and was cold to the touch at their rental house, 559 Highway 136, about 9 miles west of Fairbury. Rescue workers found DeJong badly beaten. He was taken to Fairbury Community Health Center and then to Bryan LGH Medical Center West by ambulance. He died in Lincoln late Friday evening. According to a probable cause affidavit for Susan DeJong's arrest, Thomas DeJong sustained injuries to nearly all of his body and would have had great pain and suffering from the wounds. A Lincoln doctor who examined Thomas DeJong reported numerous small incisions, as well as bruising over most of his body and face. He suffered blunt force, trauma to his brain, and bruising near his knees was similar to injuries received by pedestrians being struck by an automobile, according to the affidavit. The beating appeared to have taken place throughout the main floor of the house, as blood was found in most of the rooms. The affidavit states, "Seized during a search of the house was a weapon described as either a sword or bayonet, according to the affidavit. Blood and hair were found on the weapon's metal sheath." Lincoln police investigators spoke with Susan DeJong after she drove to the Lincoln Hospital Friday. According to the affidavit, she told them at one point that another woman caused some of Thomas DeJong's injuries. When asked by a detective what had happened with a coffee cup earlier in the day, Susan DeJong replied that his head cracked it, according to the affidavit. Following the interview and a search of the couple's rental home, investigators believed Susan DeJong was solely responsible for Thomas DeJong's death. After being jailed Saturday in Lincoln, she was transported to jail in Jefferson County. Collins said the couple recently moved to rural Fairbury from South Dakota. Results of Thomas DeJong's autopsy are pending, she said. Jefferson County Attorney Linda Bauer said she likely would file charges later this week.